Hi everybody, this is Bruce with Habowskistudio, and today I'm going to be painting a landscape of a barn with some hay bales, and I'm going to be painting it on an 8x10 MDF panel that has canvas glued onto it, and then I've taken some gesso and I've aggressively gessoed it to create a little more texture. I don't normally paint on that rough a surface. I like it a little smoother, but I want to experiment, try something different, see what kind of textural elements I can get to the painting, and try something new. So thanks for joining me, and I'm going to try to zoom in here a little bit so you can see if it picks up some of that texture. Okay, the palette I'm going to be using for this painting is what I believe I've heard called a chromatic palette. From left to right, we have ivory black, titanium white, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, cerulean blue, cad yellow pale, yellow ochre, cad yellow medium, cad red medium, and vermilion. I would have put cad red light there, but I didn't have any up here in the studio, and that's pretty similar. So that's what we're going to be using today. Okay, to begin, of course, I'll be inserting a clip of the palette that I'm using for the painting. And here's the three brushes I'm going to attempt to do this in. I think this will facilitate trying to keep my strokes big. Too big a brush, too much wider. I don't think I'd like the effect of what I want to paint for the scale with the brush strokes that would result with a bigger brush. I think that would be too distracting. I think this would be big enough. I can manipulate it then with the bristle round, the size 8 round, and this is like a filbert size 6. And then I have these great little, for detail, Robert Simmons expressions brushes, size 2. Really nice brushes. I really love these, and being so small, it actually gives you a little bigger handle to have a better grip. So very, very nice. I'm going to start with a little overall toning, then sketch it out. Now you've seen this in many of my videos with the toning procedure. That with some Gamsol is all I'm going to be using today. I don't need a big heavy tone. I just want to kill the whites, and especially with the texture that I'm using, I don't want any flecks of that white showing through. If you remember the video on the enlarging the plein air piece I did, I wish I would have done that landscape. I think it was 18 by 24 with a some kind of tone to kill that white. Do that. Get our little, I like the Bounty paper towels, nice and, I don't get in, because of the rough texture, I'm not going to get in too much to buffing hard with the paper towel, because then I'll leave kind of debris behind, because you'll be basically, the texture will act as like a sandpaper against it. See how it's already kind of getting the paper towel ratty a bit? Just kill some of that white. Now the photo that I'm working from is just printed off the printer in fast draft. It's not very super saturated color or anything like that. So I'll be enhancing some parts of the image and changing a few things. My main focus is this right in here. I'm really loving that. And so if I was to, matter of fact, let me go ahead and just get a basic generic line on here. You know, I'm kind of thinking that, something along those lines. Have maybe a third sky, 2/3 grass and such. Having this working from a photo, it's kind of rainy out here in Maine, and not supposed to be a pretty day outside, even though the temperature's not bad. Would have been nice to get out and do some painting. That's the way it is. And so this will simulate like I'm looking at something, because it's right adjacent to my panel, as if I'm looking out in nature. I'm not looking for a perfect copy of this. I'm just taking elements I want. picking my dividing line. This will be all grass, and here's, excuse me, the shapes. The key sometimes when you're painting something is as you're focusing in on it, you can tend to make shapes too big. And it's important to try to not do that. Blotting off just a bit of this, a little heavy with the terps in there, so I'm going to thicken up the paint in an adjacent pile on the palette. Touch of the reddish color in there. I'm not really too concerned with super detail. Just feeling out the compositional idea I said. And every time you start a painting, it can, depending on how you're tackling it, I'm trying to tackle this more as if I'm outdoors painting. So in the studio, I might use a different method, a little more controlled. And also sometimes I do that in the field too, but just trying to have a different approach this time. I'm going to have, you can see how I'm moving the bale down. This is just a stealing elements from the scene to use just to get some balance to the composition. I'll be changing some of this. This is very divisional, all these streaks of the hay, because the way the field was cut. I'm going to change that a little bit to lead into the focal point. So that is the plan. I'm going to get a little bit of yellow ochre mixed into that little wash I have of the blue and the red, just to create a grayish green kind of. Again, you know, I'm parallel to the painting surface. I'm not too thick yet with the paint. Just seeing how I might play up some of the directional lines. Testing out while it's in this beginning stage. Kind of liking that. Now I'm going to get into mixing a tone for the sky to set the key for the other values. Again, I'll be pushing this a little stronger in value because this is sort of a washed out print. I just knew that how I wanted to adapt it to the painting. So let's get some sky going, and parts of this will be in time lapse. And also in the beginning stages, I'm not going too crazy with super finishing one spot. I'm trying to experiment with adding a little, having a little more activity in the brushwork. Again, I'm trying to simulate like I'm painting outdoors, and I'm deciding on the lightness of value, that if I like that, and I do. Now I'm going to go for the, get some green in the tree line. A little yellow ochre, cerulean blue, and if I need to temper that, I can do it with either some red or black. Test a few spots, letting it drag using the side of my brush. Don't worry about going over the shape of your barn area. When I come in with that smaller brush, that's when I'll clean up in the final accents. I'm liking some of that. Now I'm going to get a little ultramarine. I haven't really cleaned out my brush. And getting a little cad yellow medium with ultramarine. Tempering it with a little bit of the red. And in between some of that, having some different tones of green, and just have variety and some intensity of the green. Now get some of that yellow ochre again, touch of the red, a little bit of the cad yellow pale, and just, it's thicker paint because I'm not really getting terps in there, but it's not super thick yet. I'll work on some of those details, thickening that up in later stages with the round, small round. Now I'm doing a little cerulean blue, yellow ochre, more yellow ochre in relation to the mount. And in the distance we do have some hay streaks from leftover raked up bales there. So I'm going to, too green. I'm going to take a little yellow ochre, get a little more white into that. A little bit of red, better. And if it's chromatically a little touch too bright, I'm in the beginning stages of the painting, so I don't really have a lot of comparative notes yet. So I'll leave that for a bit, but I will pick up some of these colors in the beginning stages of creating directional flow to my focal point. So I'm liking some of the flow of lines there. Rinse my brush a bit. Cerulean blue, white, ochre. Yes, you see how very nice that is. Create some interest, directional strokes. Mixing up a little more quantity. White, ochre, cerulean blue. Knocking an edge up against the distant tree line. So I will be darkening some of those trees to set off against the grass. It's more about getting the value and the tone of the hue of the grass correct. And yes, you could just mix up a big giant pile of the color once you nail the value and color, but I kind of like doing batches at a time because you get a subtle difference in, like this, a little more yellow green against the more bluer green. So that can be useful for variety in the field, so you don't have just a plain boring mass. And as I develop this field, I'll even get a few highlights with the cerulean and the cad yellow light. That'll give a nice effect. And I'll manipulate some of the stroke size later also as I get paint on there in terms of scale, so that you don't have a big stroke like in the foreground and the same big stroke in the background, because you want to create a sense of depth, which can be done with the scale of the objects and atmospheric perspective, but you still want to pay attention to your brush work if your intention is to give a sense of realism. I mean, you could manipulate it to be an interpretation big time of the landscape. Same value, so it's not standing out much. I'm going to go with a little more white and the cad yellow pale with a little bit of the ochre, so it's not like too acidic. And just cut a few cross strokes just to give interest to this field also. When I use elements from reference from the outdoors, I'm doing that because I really like the scene that I took a picture of. I'm not looking to recreate too much. The beauty came from what I saw out there in nature. So while I will select some elements for design and composition, I don't go too crazy at all inventing. I think you can get in danger zones then, because you think, I'll just make it up, but then what are you learning? What's the point of, you know, painting outdoors then sometimes? All right, I'm liking the relationships of the big shapes, the value of the sky. I will work on the tree line, of course, pulling out some darker accents, especially when I put the rim lighting on the barn roof. While it is a little darker, obviously, in tone, don't forget this is a fast draft photo, but I am going to keep it with the darker tone that I have here. Again, just trying to get some base tone, and now I can get a little white into that mixture of blue, a touch of ochre just to and there's a little bit of terps in the paint. The paint's a little wet, so to speak. It's not very, for lack of a better term, pasty, because you can always take, if you think you have too much, take your paper towel, and I'm pressing with a fair amount of force. And what's interesting, I'm taking off the excess wetness, but it also creates a mottled effect that could very well play into, obviously, the feeling of the barn, texture, and that sort of thing. Something to always kind of be aware of. Don't, when you're doing something in a painting, don't just haphazardly do things. Let the painting, you know, you're painting something, but you're also creating a painting. So the painting has to do some talking also. Very important too. And important here to really be, don't rush through, really study scale, like, you know, how big you make your hay bales are, you know, a certain relation to the height of a human. I mean, they're pretty big, actually. And you want to be careful when you get back in a distance how big you're making your hay bales. That area that I originally mapped out for the hay bales back there, which was just a generic kind of shape reference for what's going on, I will now start cleaning up some darker tones and scale. If I get it fairly close, and then as I come in with the small brush later, I can clean those up even more. Some value pulled out a little lighter. And then I'm going to turn around and start doing a little bit with the bristle round on the trees, pulling out some dark shapes here and there. So I'll do a little time lapse on this. Now I'm going to start with a few details to give me some parameters to stay within. Once I nail those, then I can say, how much more do I need? So, and it'll help start defining the painting and let me know how much detail I need in other areas. So of course we got the white roof here, trying to apply this. I want it to really pop. Going with straight white. And what I'll do, sometimes you keep trying to adjust the color you're putting on when the adjustment needs to happen behind. So a couple things I'll do is darken a little bit of the sky value behind this white, because there's only so much I can do on the front end here, so to speak. Touch of the sky original color here, and clean up, number one, clean up the edge of the roof a little bit. It pops a little more. Just needs a little. I don't want to go too crazy with the darkness around. So one of the things you can fight with this, for me particularly, is wanting to have control. And you know, there's only so much effect you can get with the surface you're using, and of course the limitation of brushes and so on. So you have to accept that. I'm going to go ahead and, what happens a lot of these barns, one side's like shingled, one side might be painted on, you know, only painted on one side. So, and that's the case with this. So we'll test this in relation to what's around it. You want it to sit in space, and that seems to be pretty good. I'm going to try. Sometimes you can try to go a little chromatically stronger, because you can always dull it down, but once you dull it down too much, pulling it back could be a problem. Just to get some highlight on these bales back here, start defining some edges. I don't want it too yellowy. And if I want on the highlight to create an area that's a little more intense within the highlight, I can pick up the leftover chromatic part. I'm going to pick up some of that in finessing the foreground bale. Obviously still needs work. And the side of the hay bale here is in shadow, but parts stick out and catch light, break up some edge a little bit. Just picking up mixtures that I've mixed on my palette already, dabbing into this and that to find the value. And this hay bale is a little big. I'm going to shape it up a bit with the green around it. There we go. I'm going to pick up just a little, pull out some edges against the barn over here, subtle. Make the highlight on the hay bale pop a little more by darkening what's around it. And we got some highlights on the bales on the left here by the barn. Trying to get up enough of a mixture to plant, pull, stop, pick up. My mixture on my palette, I'm trying to pick up, get a ridge of paint, and then apply it. And you could, there's one hay bale here I'm getting ready to work on that requires the side to be lit in sunlight, and that's green. What you can do, so you don't have to fight anything, is just wipe out some of that, so it's not as wet. If you just plant and pull and create effect, it's going to mix a little bit, but now you can adjust that just with thicker paint. So I'm going to work on that with some time lapse. Okay, here's what I've got so far. I've got the base tones of everything on there, but now the next step is I'm going to mix up all these colors again in larger quantities. Straight pigment, trying to use very, very little terps when necessary, and going to really attempt to slather the painting with luscious strokes. We'll see. I didn't do that in the beginning. For me personally, I don't like doing that in the beginning, because then if you're not sure of something because you don't have enough notes to compare, like especially when I start with sky, then you're just fighting against that later on. It's possible to do. Obviously, there's painters out there that do that, but I like to get to this stage and then I can commit to really applying some thicker paint. I usually don't do that, so this is all an experiment, and we'll see if it works. Okay, let me mix up some paint and then we'll get going. But it's been interesting using just a fine selection of a small selection of brushes. I got the paint pre-mixed on the palette, of course, with the original colors I mentioned before, cerulean blue. Mixed that with yellow ochre, some cad red medium, and a little bit of red in one of them to create some different variations, grayish and more a little richer greens, still grayed down a little bit. And I'm going to try to, rather than apply paint like this, that will disturb what I have going on, I'm going to really try to, almost like this is a palette knife. I might even incorporate my palette knife in some areas, but I'm going to try to stick with my original plan of just using the brushes. So you won't get many strokes out of this. So rather than just arbitrarily put them on, I'm trying to think about what I want to do with them as I apply them. Trying to let them set up off the surface a bit. I can go back afterwards and manipulate them. Trying to roll the brush sometimes. It's very easy for the human brain to want to make repetitive, same looking strokes. Attempting to avoid that. This is a chance to cut back around and clean up some shapes. I'm not going with too many furrows like in the grass. I'm sure I'll manipulate a little bit somehow. Might even experiment taking loose mixtures, like mixing loosely with my brush on the palette. So that is the idea that I'm going to attempt here with this field. So I'm going to now switch over to some time lapse because you get the idea of what I'm attempting to do, and I'm just going to work on that. Okay, it's shaping up. As you can see, I've incorporated a palette knife in applying the paint. Put the paint on a palette knife and manipulate with a brush. Now I'm taking the small brush, trying to get like the bits of hay in the distance, a little different color in a field, and also as a device to set off against the tree line. And just some key strokes in certain parts of the highlight on the bales. Not the whole highlight, just bits here and there. So you end up with a variety. Trying to get that, if the paint's dry enough, you can kind of just scumble over the wet paint that's there, but because this bale, you know, it's easy to paint the bales like these up here, but this one's a little off kilter, and I want to tackle it and see how I do. Getting some variety in this bale back here. Connected these two bales to create a unit. I want to fix this rounding of the bale there. Barely touching the edges of the highlights to integrate them because it's not an angular curve. I'm going to push the ultramarine and the red mixture down near the edge, so I have variety in the shadow. Now I'm going to experiment with a little bit of palette knife work in the tree line. See what happens. I'll put it on, modify it with the brush. Pull out that red and this roof line, create some just touch. Don't want to get away with so many strokes. Want that most intense, not necessarily intense, sorry, darker value along that barn edge. There we go. Where I just applied palette knife, just barely touching, picking up some of that paint, moving it elsewhere. And now I'm going to, actually, I think I'm going to break a bit of sky in that tree line to add some variety. I'm thinking right in here, pulling out some of that green and putting in some sky. Okay, I'm really liking how the painting's kind of taken on its own life. It's really a special thing. And now I'm just going to break that edge, just, alter a few edges here and there as I cut around strongly with the sky color. Just add a little variety back there. I don't want to go too crazy with things going on, take away from the focal point. Just felt like it needed a space back there. So now I'm going to take a little bit of the white with the sky mixture right at the edge there to give that, try to get that distance feel. Just a few more things to do on this, I think, before I call it done. And I'm actually going to cut around the edge of this little building here. Clean up that edge a bit. Now I'm going to put in a little vertical pole, just something for a little interest. And there is something in the photo. I'm going to put it right not too intrusive. Obviously, I've got to make it set off a little more. This is always good. Okay, just I think I'm just about there. Touch up a little bit of the hay bale edge here. Try to suggest a little bit of straw. And when you start to noodle around too much, you start to just stare at it, poke at this and that. There's a level of that. If after like 3 minutes, 5 minutes maybe, and you're still just staring at it and poking, and I'm pretty confident that you need to consider it done. Otherwise, you're asking to kill it down too much. So, I think I'm going to call that. Call it done. Hope you liked it. Okay, I want to thank you for joining me for this little painting demonstration. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your comments, let me know what you thought, and get the dialogue going about painting. And until next time, see you later. Bye.